the Scrutiny Committee. I'm Chancellor Mary Wheel, Chair of the committee. The event's being streamed on YouTube live, and members of the public and media are welcome to the meeting and listen to the discussions. I'd like to welcome all the members of the committee here in Committee Room 1. And before we start the meeting, I would ask all members of the committee and anyone watching here to make sure that their mobile phones are on silent or switched off. I'm going to go back to follow my own advice. Because at this point in the meeting, it's appropriate for us to start with 72 seconds of silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Thank you, everybody. I've received apologies for absence from Councillors Yankson, Knight and Thaxter, and for lateness from Pascal Will, Pascal and Toby Benton. So then they'll be joining us shortly. Does any member of the committee have a declaration of interest? No. Okay. Can we turn now to the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 8th of May? The minutes have been circulated. Can I assign them as the correct record?
Agreed.
Agreed. An updated version of the action tracker is next on our agenda, including an update to the Director of Housing Units. There are two actions, however, that were added in error, not because they're not actions, but because they're not for this committee, they're a specific case. In the case of the first one, which is the first item on the list, it's because it relates to a specific case. And the second action, which is sixth on the table, numbered 221/21, relates to a meeting of the licensing committee and should be dealt with. Is everyone content that these are removed from the record for future meeting?
No.
Thank you very much. I'll now withdraw. So the next paper we have is the final outcome report. Quarter forward of the revenue and capital revenue and capital. It sets out our final financial outcome position, so this is the most important one of the year. And I would like to ask the director, either Mike or Johnny or both or Amanda, to introduce it.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to bring this paper. I think, as you say, it's one of the most important of the year. This year, it's a much more difficult outcome than we've had previously. As you can see, there's an overspend, which historically we haven't tended to have. In terms of what's driven it, I think the clear pressures are primarily in TA and homelessness. For example, if you were to take TA out of the departmental spends, then our departments are actually faring pretty well, and they're probably just about underspent. So I think what we might take from that is that there are enormous pressures about which we should be concerned, but that generally speaking, there's lots of good work happening in the council too, and that the overspend overall doesn't reflect that there's kind of problems in every area. I particularly commend families and adults where there are really difficult demand-led services and quite uncertain kind of funding arrangements, but which are nevertheless pretty much in balance. Elsewhere, we can see that things like treasury management have been problematic for us this year in terms of how we're budgeting, and there are one or two other areas. So I think it's a case of There are 3 or 4 kind of big problems in terms of the budget that have driven the overspend, but overall there continues to be lots of good work.
Thank you. Mike, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a little. I mean, I think it is disappointing, obviously, that it's an overspend. It's the first of my career, so it's quite dramatic for me. But I think at 4 million, it is what we've been predicting for most of the year, that we would be around that sort of number. It's increased a little bit at the end of the year, but it's pretty much where we've expected. And a lot of councils have overspent by, I won't run through a great long list of them, but we know a lot of London councils are overspent by considerably more, and it is sort of indicative of the pressures that are now in the system, and we need to think about when we come on to the next report. The HRA obviously also covered in here, that has done better than budget, so I think it's worth saying that. And capital, although we've underspent again, got more slippage than we would like. There's less slippage than there has been in previous years, which I think is a good thing. And I think as Johnny said, the overspends are mainly driven by a small number of areas, Treasury, and the overspends on general fund, sorry, are driven by a small number of areas, but it is gratifying that children and adults haven't overspent. I think that is actually quite unusual.
I mean, I saw a thing in the press today that said that was it Bexley had overspent by 13 million in children's. That's not, I don't know how representative that is, but it does show the spectrum of outcomes. And therefore, I think it shows that sort of ANC has done pretty well in some of the hardest areas. But as we said, the things we talked about and things like contract inflation have driven the position that we see in front of us.
Thank you. Gosh, I'll start. Jan, do you want to ask the first question?
Essentially, for me, when I look at this as a helicopter approach, it's the fundamental building blocks that don't look good for next year, as in they're all behind this year. Sorry, not all children, but my concern when you read the sort of forecasts and where we're going next year is actually whether those building blocks are the right building blocks for the future, and also what can we do about the temporary accommodation.
Well, I think you're right to be concerned because the outlook has become more challenging. And I'll look forward to the committee's support when we present our draft budget, because that will have to include some pretty tough decisions and some pretty difficult reductions in some areas. I don't think all of the building blocks are worrying. I think as Mike has alluded to, there are specific areas where we're finding things hard. I think there are other areas where actually the position could, for example, improve this year. So if we think about environment and neighbourhoods, for example, at Q1, there was quite a big overspend, which was driven by industrial action. We're in Q1 of the subsequent year now, and that hasn't arisen in quite the same way. So that's the example of tailwind rather than the headwind. But in terms of TA, the overspends are significant all over the city, and so we'll need to look at different kinds of models. And I think it's fair to say there are a lot of people across the council thinking about how best to do that in the context of our financial envelope, thinking about what's in the general fund, what's in the HRA, the pension fund, all the kinds of levers that we have available. And we're definitely pressing officers to model every scenario so that we can best manage it. And we've also put additional money into next year's budget, notionally, for now, so to reflect that challenge.
A lot of what you see here is that the position has worsened since quarter 3 into quarter 4, as opposed to getting better, and that's the wrong directional trend.
I think some things have worsened and some have got better. I mean, or staying the same. I mean, we have, I would say, every area that's driving this overspend, we've done something about in the budget process that we set last March. I'm not going to say there's not going to be an overspend, or that we haven't got challenges in the coming year, but in every area action is being taken. And you know, Johnny mentioned TA, and we put more in the budget and all the actions that he talked about there. So I think that's important, and the number of people in hotels is already coming down. So there's still a lot of pressure on that budget, but it is
Probably
something
worth
to
saying
go in
as
the
well.
right direction.
Isn't it right that our prevention work is some of the most successful in London? So in terms of trying to ensure that we have the best possible service, I think there's a lot of good work happening. And I mean, the majority of London boroughs are even more overspent in homelessness. So I think there's going to be an ongoing challenge. Hopefully what we put in the budget will be sufficient, but if not, I guess we'll need to look at where we can get supply in terms of homelessness, and that will potentially be quite difficult because you're looking at the differential between the overspend and how much we're spending each week on things like hotels versus the cost of leasing or buying outright a building. And if you're leasing, I guess there's a smaller upfront cost, but if you're buying, then potentially the capital cost is either extremely challenging or prohibitive.
We overspent on pay by 1.6 million because the cost of the pay award was 1.6 million more than we budgeted for. We budgeted for the same amount for this year, and I think the pay award will be lower. The cost of the pay award will be lower. So I think that won't overspend this year. So that's a big driver. Digital news service overspend there that we're doing work on. I think that will be lower, and treasury management. I think that's we probably got the budget wrong there, to be honest, because of all the changes in interest rates and so forth. But I think it's a more robust budget this year. Plus, there won't be as many changes in the wrong direction for us. So that I think will be that'll be a better position. But there will still be pressures in TA, and there will be other pressures that will emerge. That not least that with the settlement itself. The settlement this year we're in is fine, but the settlement for next year will create more pressure. So we're in a very difficult period.
Thank you. I was also going to ask about the temporary accommodation overspend. And I suppose Janice kind of asked really what I was going to say, but I just wonder whether going forwards in the forthcoming budget, we will need to be adjusting the amount that we're planning for, given that we have an overspend rather.
I think we are planning to build in quite a bit of additional capacity.
We've got 1.5 million.
Yeah, 1.5.
That's on top of what's question I want to ask. So given we've overspent how much on temporary accommodation, is the extra allocation that to this year's overspend plus 500,000 next year?
No, it's 1.5 up from where we were. So
That's 500,000 just each year for 3 years, doesn't it? Seems to. I thought it was only 500,000 a year.
1.5.
It's 1.5 for this year, and it can't be for the following 3 years after.
So given that we've overspent much more than that,
4.8.
4.8 this year of housing needs, is just putting 1.5 million in enough?
So we've got to do all the other measures to try and get the overspend down as well. But I mean, if it's possible, it's not, but we have to do those other measures. I mean,
I think it's hard to say. I mean, it might not be enough. I think we have to try and balance. I say balance with an outturn. I think metaphorically, we have to balance the consideration in terms of how sustainable these pressures be in terms of our budget. So what do we need to build in permanently? How much additional or spare resource we have within the budget? How much slack we have in order to meet the challenge? I suppose where we've been at the moment is that's what we have taken the view is affordable within the envelope that we have, without making additional reductions to services elsewhere in the council. But we may
doesn't really matter, does it? Because it's a budget, and either we're budgeting the right amount for what we're actually going to outturn spend, or
I think we're also looking at whether the real pressure has happened over the last 12, 18 months. It's not obvious where we'll be 12, 18 months on. I think if our prevention work is successful, if we are able to get more supply, whether that is through leasing or ownership of additional buildings, whether it's through general fund or pension fund, there are potentially levers that would reduce the pressure. So I think at the moment, there is sufficient reason to think that the pressures could, ease a little bit. But I mean, I have no doubt it's going to continue to be a challenge.
Can I just say, because one of the things that comes out in this report is that the housing team expected a fall in the numbers, and in fact it stayed stable and the cost went up. So it was a double whammy, and you fundamentally therefore ask, why did they think it was going to fall following a cost of living crisis? And therefore, and then the exponential side of that is that the costs of it also then went up because everybody's chasing after the same accommodations. So you wonder about the fundamental assessment in the first place.
I mean, I thought we take advice from the housing department in terms of projections of demand. So I'm probably not. I don't think I can say too much.
Timing issue as well. So lots of measures have been put in place now, but perhaps we didn't take full account of when the benefit would start to kick in. So we are seeing some of that now, but we didn't feel the full benefits in 2020.
Yeah. So you're correct that the budget, I think the overspend has gone up from Q3 to Q4, but the number of people, that has been a reduction in the number of people in hotels, but that doesn't feed through, and that descends until later because of the timing. So the cost of people being in hotels for the year, the cost of people being in expensive accommodation for the year is already baked in to the figures and comes out in this outturn. So the actions that are being taken will create benefits this year. But I don't want to understate at the same time. I don't want to say that's going to solve the problem, because it is a big area of pressure. I think putting in some, it obviously will help. Putting in the 1.5 million. Could it have been more? Potentially, but I think we have got a fairly large contingency as well. That was all spent last year, and the pay award took up a fair chunk of that. That won't happen this year. So there are other, as well as trying to get the spend down, there is also other budgets to absorb.
That's not really what they're for, if people can see it, but I'll go on with asking
questions. I don't know that we can foresee it. I think the aim is definitely to exist within the last year's budget plus 1.5 million. We're recognising it might be challenging, because that is the aim.
It should be last year's outturn, surely.
It's a noble whatever to try and reduce the expenditure and therefore reduce the budget, but it just seems quite a big leap from 4.8 to. But why don't we move on and let move on to Brooke?
Can I just make one more point? I just think we need to also maybe caution against overstating the likely impact of our excellent, albeit prevention work, because I think there's a limit to that, how that can actually impact.
Sure. Before I go to the obvious challenging areas, I'd just like to welcome the capital budget. At last, the consideration that the council is going to spend some borough 18.8. That's very good news, and it takes time. But we're to spend borough welcome. I'm also personally pleased to see the continued focus on maintenance of unowned historic built features in paragraph 16.12. So thank you for that. And in terms of going to the revenue opportunity at 15.6, where the residents parking permits have produced less money than expected to produce demand. And I think this is not something this team will be able to do. The borough does need to look at perhaps extending the eligibility so we can sell some more in the context of reduced demand and therefore surplus places. So I think that's something that the council collectively should look at, and this has been taken back to the leadership team. John, where I'm concerned, obviously TA, we've spoken a lot about that. Paragraph 15.9, I didn't understand that paragraph at all. To me, it's not in English, but I think I've deduced that it's an overspend in an IT project, and I don't want to preempt questions that Chris is going to ask in a moment, but that's, having come from the Ministry of Defence, government procurement programs, particularly in IT, going over budget or over time are not unfamiliar to me, but it doesn't make it any less embarrassing. And I'd be concerned about that. And again, not wishing to preempt Mary's questioning the fact that the savings, if not all coming last year, bakes in a further problem for the future. So I think the difficult decisions that the council has to take this year are a very high degree, need a very high degree of focus, and I think it's something we ought to look at in the budget working group when we internally in the committee speak about that. But I think a real focus on non-customer facing staff and on facilities, basically overheads. I think there's a lot to be done. I'm not saying that I know the council doesn't need a director of finance or chief executive. I know neither of you are directly customer facing, but there are areas that I think we do need to look at very carefully. Final point I think I wanted to make was the collection rate on council tax. It does have, it's good to see it's improved to 96%. But is it on track? So it hasn't recovered to pre-pandemic levels of collection yet. Is it your assessment that it is on track to recover to 98.5%, or have we stalled at 96%? So that's a few all random.
Let's try to pick up and I guess remind us as we list them. I know the first thing you talked about was the capital program that we're using still more effectively.
Observation in that.
But I want to join you in welcoming that, because we did come to a previous meeting and discuss it, and we took that away, and obviously we've made a change on the partly on the basis of that. I would also join you in welcoming the work on historic news options. That's something that came up at a residents association meeting in my ward just this week in Holland Park. It is a work program that they're very interested in. In terms of parking permits, we know there's a structural kind of decline in the number of residential permits being issued. I wouldn't have thought that's going to change direction. It could accelerate or decelerate, I suppose. But fundamentally, people are driving less on the whole. So what you suggest would be one way to buttress the kind of budget line there. You're right that it would be a policy decision probably for the lead member, but I think that and several of the other things that you talked about fit into work streams that we've already identified are going to be important for meeting the next budget gap. So one of them is improved commercialization. So thinking about how we can, I suppose, charge more effectively for the services we provide. I mean, clearly there are lots of areas where their cost recovery and parking is constrained in how it can be spent. But there are probably opportunities across the council in ways that we haven't sort of previously to try and fund some of our essential services. I would have thought that's one of the areas that we would consider, although I don't want to make definitive statements about it at this stage. In terms of staffing, that's probably the single biggest area of focus for the transformation and savings work. I think we are going to need to look first at non-customer facing roles, and that work's underway. And I think the leadership team are very aware that that's going to be a real focus for the committee, and we hope to bring back plans for that in the autumn. We have away days and meetings on it before the summer and hope to make more progress. But I think there are quite a few things underway already, whether these the recruitment panels, the process reviews, or one or two other mechanisms that are kind of already going live within the organisation to try and start that process. And I haven't had detail yet on kind of what the trend is arising from that work, but based on the advice we're receiving, that should go quite a long way once you add all of those things together, to place in the budget gap. But if we return to the questions on TA that we had a few minutes ago, I suppose if we've closed the budget gap or close to close the budget gap by the autumn, it may be that we do want to put additional money aside in the budget and grow the gap again in order to make accommodation for what we think is a burgeoning problem with homelessness. I recognise the force of the questions and the challenge that you put to us. These are fine judgments. I think it's difficult to know where we'll get to, but we should keep those options on the table, I suppose, because it's really important that we do get our accounting right.
But TA is an operational need, so we do need to fund it, and how we do it. So what's the next budget for? You didn't get around to commenting on facilities, which was something that I mentioned. And
okay, well that I can deal with that quite directly. So when we think about the different work streams that are parts of the transformation and savings program, one of them is to do with how we're using the corporate estate. I think how we use our facilities is something that could be done a lot more efficiently.
Empty building here, for example.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, well, I agree insofar as certainly the occupancy within this building and other key buildings like Pembroke Road have dropped sharply after COVID. Working habits have changed. I think the organisation has tried to do the right thing in encouraging people to be in at least 3 days a week. And that's the right target. But even if we were to hit that target, and I don't think we have yet, we would still have more capacity in terms of workspace than we had previously when people were basically in 4 or 5 days. So I think there's opportunity there. And we have challenged officers to go away and model some different scenarios. And I'm quite open to making, fairly substantial changes so that if we can find the evidence base and it helps us close those gaps. Because there's no point in the council paying for lighting and heating and all the rest that comes with it in a building that isn't really used.
Absolutely. And the collection rate on just before I finish, collection rate on operations. What's your assessment of your range?
Yeah, I think it is recovering, but I mean the problem is that after the pandemic, we went sort of straight into the cost of living crisis, so that will affect the rates as well. So I think we will increase over time as we move forward, but it is more challenging than it was before the pandemic.
Probably too early to say how it's looking this year on third month in.
Yeah, I think it's,
well, I keep asking for our P2 figures, which is the figure that we get in terms of an outside after the second month of the financial year, but even I haven't had a preview of that yet.
Obviously.
So I await it too with bated breath.
Did you want me to mention just a couple of other things on the facilities? I think the ways forward are either on more income generation or disposal. They're the only potential ways. We have got in this year in 24-25 savings on facilities management already built in that are going to be delivered this year, and they're being achieved. That's primarily through procurement, probably through a contract process. So once they're achieved, which is a process that's ongoing at the moment, once they're achieved, they'll be kind of baked in. So it must be utilisation or ultimately disposal, which is kind of part of utilisation, if we can put people more together. But they're the ways that we can further reduce the facilities costs. And if you want the paragraph 15.9, which is obviously about my department, all it's saying is that there's a net overspend for the department of 365,000, but DD&T, what used to be called IT, is overspent by just over £1 million. So that's mitigated by underspend elsewhere in my department. So the net position is 365. The reason for and that sort of repeats throughout. There are, actually on service budgets in this whole outturn, the overall overspend is only 1.4 million on service budgets, but that hides lots of overs and unders, as it always does.
I'm sure Chris will ask a bit more
Yeah.
about the IT when we get towards it. So I'll defer, come back afterwards.
Okay, Toby, did you want to ask anything, just to come back to you?
Not just yet.
Right. Well,
Thank you. Apologies for being late. Hopefully you got my message. First, three things grouped together. Is the end of 23, 24, which will get most? Okay.
Yeah. And the opposite effect will.
Is the outcome looking at reflected in the base numbers of the MTFS that we're going on to? So in other words, are those two papers aligned? And it appears that despite some actions that you've been talking about in response to some of the questions, that really we're looking at the beginnings of the financial headwind that was identified firstly by sort of Taryn and Lisa and colleagues recently. And I don't think we're yet beginning to see any of the outcome of the work on transformations. And there appears from the language being used in response that we've risked slipping back into a climate of slicing and cutting, and leaving very little room for the efficiencies that you, John, have talked about on previous occasions to create scope to reinvest in becoming the best council. So I don't see much evidence of a response other than very expert account management. And then I'll go on to FCS in a minute. But I think the overall thing is that I think this is business as usual. It's been a bit difficult in places. It's been extremely well managed, and you've got a reasonable outcome. Don't actually see any evidence of change.
Well, I suppose the outside is an account management piece primarily. But if your comments relate also to the MTFS, then perhaps like more kind of clear on the route ahead in terms of transformation. I suppose at the same time, its primary function is to set out where we anticipate the gap to be. In terms of the transformation program, I don't know whether Mike or Maxine wants to update on kind of where we've got to, because obviously we've had lots of...
Do you want to do that under... Chair, do you want to do that under the MTFS?
But the question is quite directed towards transformations.
Yeah.
I'm happy to get officers' input now if useful.
yeah, that's fine.
So I was just going to offer specifically related to the outcome. I don't think what the outcome report doesn't particularly include is lots of detail in terms of the delivery of the £12 million savings from last year. But it reports that the majority of those savings were delivered. But you'll see in the detail of some of those, that some of those were, I think, more on the transformational side. And I suppose the three probably that I particularly pick out would be the libraries, the street enforcement team, and the changes to customer services that you heard about from Sophie Evans when we talked about savings and transformation at the committee last time.
Yeah.
Between those three savings, 2.3 million. So I completely agree with you, Councillor Pascal, that there isn't detail in this outturn report, and I'm more than happy to come back when we do talk about savings and transformation the next time at committee, which is coming up, to then also talk about some of that kind of track record as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, I was trying to work off the basis of what was here presented to us and say there's a missing piece, and you've said that's coming, so that answers that question. I'm focusing more on children's services. I note that from section 2 on page 58 that there's a lot of one-offs, and they add up to what's being reported on screen. But what is, I think, what we're going to need over this next year with FCS, I know my colleagues agree with in their areas as well, but some more detailed analysis of how things are working in the non-exceptional items, because that's really the long-term driver of both costs and efficiencies and the service that we give. And we haven't got time here to go into that more FCS committee area, but what would be really useful would be some kind of, I suppose it's the old-fashioned SWOT analysis of looking at these cover pages, what's the SWOT picture to do with that directorate? Where are the opportunities going to come from? Where are the threats, and so on. But this is very much obviously an end of term snapshot, which mentions the big events that cricket balls may hit the six during the previous summer, which is all very fine, but it doesn't tell us much about how to go forward and what to look for in terms of the granularity of how we achieve better service delivery with more efficiency, which must be the driving force in that area. So I think the question I'm asking is it possible, as a follow-up to this from officers, to have some more of that granularity with regard to that directorate, perhaps delivered to us as FCS rather than OSC, so that we can then report back from FCS, having done a bit more deep dive into it, to look at what the drivers are for costs and benefits in terms of efficiencies there.
True class report.
Yeah, so if I could answer it, if you're happy to provide it, then that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it probably would come from families in terms of the department and their business support in the finance department. But yeah, in principle, I don't see why that couldn't come to your committee.
But it's got to be tethered within this budget report, so you can do a cross reference.
I think everything, the MTFS report, to get back to your first question, is tethered in the headwinds that we face that are in this outturn report, but it isn't probably the job of the outturn report to move on to the what do we do about it. It's more about reporting on it and us saying that the budget that we've already set addresses the pressures that are in here, and the MTFS is about the next 3 years budgets, obviously, and we will address the pressures that are in it. I do think that our pressures are, there are also a lot of pressures in the system that haven't been reflected here, like we've talked about adults and children's pressures that are across London, across the country. They haven't led to our overspends here, but we still need to be addressing them very much. So,
but what I'm trying to talk about here is this segmentation into snapshot of historical, and then looking at the budget, which is 1 year ahead, and then the MTFS. They seem to be done as separate operations. And if in the context of schools, for instance, to turn around a school, or to green a school physically on the capital side, or to do any of these initiatives that one might do in terms of prevention measures, or green or something of that sort, which is the granularity within that area, and then a quick quote granularity within other areas as well. Those things tend to be 2 to 3 year programs, and they don't just sit comfortably with a historical snapshot or 1 year view, and sort of in the future view, so 3 to 5 year. So it's how one creates a graph, what actions have been taken in the next year forward budget, not for budget purposes, but in terms of transforming the school's performance. But if you do, you track more kids. If you track more kids, you get more money, and therefore you have a better budgetary situation. That takes 2 to 3 years to do, at least, with best world world. And it doesn't relate to any one of the reports that we've got in there. But that's the difficulty, and I think what I'm asking for is to get that sort of 1 to 3 year view.
Yeah, no, you're asking for a more detailed paper that looks at family and children's with a SWOT element to it that identifies opportunities
based on the same data that's gone into these.
And I think I'm happy in principle for office work.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. To start off with, I will start off with on page 30, paragraph 15.9 about the customer delivery, the overspend in the IT. And of course, as Councillor Hammond said, IT is one of these areas where overspend is very likely. But would you say that the 1 million that's been overspent was a very sort of understated, or your forecast when you looked at it, when you budgeted for it?
What, that the budget was too low?
Yes.
it's mainly because we weren't able to capitalise some of the staff costs that we thought we would be able to capitalise. So that's the biggest driver there. I think it is also because it's a new service and it's still settling down a bit, and so that's driven some extra costs, and we're still getting to grips with that. So it is possible that the budget isn't as robust as it could have been. I mean, there were a lot of problems in this aggregation that led to having to put some temporary budgets in and so forth. So we need to get on.
Didn't we use £1 million of the special projects reserve to set up the DD&T department in a sovereign way? And then in the year that's just ended, we sought to, at a stroke, take that £1 million out of the budget because it hadn't been built into the base, which is quite ambitious. And my sense of life is that it's not that we haven't taken out that million, as it were, it's that there have thereafter been additional pressures that have made the net position look as it does, about which I share your concern.
And what were those additional pressures?
Yeah, I think it's just matching the budget, a new budget for a new service with the pressures that the service faces, really. The number of projects that are going on. I mean, the CRM project, for instance, the customer system that we're putting in, so that's led to some pressure that we weren't, as we say, able to capitalise it. If we'd have capitalised it, it wouldn't be here. There are some other pressures. There's a redundancy, pension strain cost that's in there of 170,000, I think, which is a result again of the establishment of the new service. And there's also some costs that we a refund for that we got for a contract that we generously gave some of to obviously doing the right thing. We generously gave some of to our former partners in Westminster.
In terms of pressures that have come to me when I talk to the DD&T department over the past year, some examples I suppose would be on the ERP, where the budget grew in the past year. I think we've come back to OSC since then and a kind of lessons learned. But I guess some of that is to do with DD&T. And it could be that in that case it was quite a big project. Some of the work we had done had not been at the level of detail that we needed, and therefore there was more cost than we anticipated. Something that came to my briefing last week was potential risk in terms of things like licenses for Microsoft. If they raise their prices, or if we can't kind of deal in terms of economies of scale, and indeed if they provide new products and we seek to roll those out, then potentially there's in-year costs that may have a benefit, but that we wouldn't have foreseen or been able to budget for at the start of the financial year. So things do come up. I mean, the former of those is kind of more capital and the latter being more revenue, but in different ways. It's the sort of department where you do have these challenges sometimes. And I've been pretty tough with DD&T over the past couple of weeks because I agree basically with the thrust of what you and with what Greg is saying, which is that the overspending in DD&T is a major concern. It's something that instinctively we probably all would have had a kind of residual concern about even going into some of these projects. And some of that residual concern has been borne out by what we're seeing. So yeah, I mean, I'm meeting the head of IT pretty much weekly at this point. I have fortnightly briefings where these sorts of issues come. But in some cases, if the costs go up, the costs go up, and it is difficult.
Mary, could I ask supplementary on that? Because from my experience as a councillor, I think this is the third time I've heard this discussion going back over the years. Every single time that we change our stance with regard to IT, implement new programs, we have cost overruns. We have, in some cases, some mission critical issues that come out, including pay our teachers. And I'm not saying it's as bad as that now. When you talk about lessons learned, is there some kind of process by which lessons can actually be learned? Because it strikes me that they haven't 10 to 12 years. In this field.
Well, Mike, you're responsible.
Well, it was a by-borough service, obviously, previously.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the previous overspends. I don't think there were in the time I've been here, but I think that there are always challenges, and we recognise fully we've got to get to grips with this with the budget here, and that's what we're seeking.
It's not the budget
we're seeking to do.
It's the budget.
Well,
budget
spend, yeah.
overspends come partly from not doing any of these transformations particularly well, and partly underestimation of work that needs to be done on them, and partly also about lack of participation by other directors in supplying some of the information. When I was running Johnny's sort of area of work, we're always saying that the other people weren't doing their transformation work right correctly, entering the data. Now we're in the process looking forwards, having best counsel, transformation, etc. IT, customer service, etc. are writ large through that, and one of the ways we're going to improve our efficiencies. And therefore, this is a mission critical part of what we do in the future. We, in the past, haven't learned lessons. Now's the time to make doubly sure that we really do learn lessons. We're going to use it as a transformatory exercise in the future to get efficiencies, to reinvest. So.
Yeah, I agree. There are also good examples of the work that DD&T is, or indeed resources are doing, I think. If we think about a similarly big project, not ERP, but CRM, that's currently progressing much better. In the past year, I don't think the budget has ballooned. I don't think the timelines have slipped dramatically.
Yeah, the timelines slipped.
Well, but we're at the end of a discovery phase now that's gone on for 12 weeks. We're looking at rolling out the first phase over the summer, which will include some of our really high volume services like parking. So I certainly take the point. I share your frustration with the overspend and indeed with some slippage on some projects, but it's also worth making the point that there's also a lot of good things happening in terms of what DD&T are doing. And also the challenge of setting up a sovereign service, because I suppose you do lose some people.
We had problems when we went on sovereign to care about it.
Well, it's the thing about change.
Yeah, exactly.
Change always brings a degree of turbulence.
Sorry, I'll stop. But I just
Yes,
I think it's a very challenging. It is a very challenging area, and it is. I mean, you're right. It's a demand-driven. It's almost a demand-driven area in some ways, and what we've got to do is say we've got to ensure that the activity matches the budget. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean. That may have to mean if the demand keeps increasing for support with systems and so forth, or it changes to systems, we may have to increase the budget or accept that we're not going to be able to bring about those changes, do the developments we need to do. We will have to make a choice. So it isn't that it is the budget and the spend we've got to look at, because the first thing that the head of IT, director of IT, says to me when I say we've got to do something about this overspend is, well, then I won't be able to meet all the demands. So we've got to balance.
Can I just ask you very briefly on this subject? Have you got any data to see that how effective all the money that we've spent, how effective the services have been?
Well, we've got metrics for IT, but all sorts of things. Yeah. So,
right. So on balance, has it been successful? 70%, 80%?
Well, I think it depends which metrics you look at. I think on most of them, we do reasonably well in terms of the amount of availability of the service and so forth. The fact that we've rolled out all the laptop program to members and officers. There's just all sorts of different things, upgrading systems as we go along. So there isn't really a simple answer, but I think there are to some extent you're defined by when there are failures, aren't you? If you don't see a failure, I mean, an area that isn't a particularly high spend area where there have been problems has been with screens and so forth. So that becomes visible. But I think in a lot of areas the service is good. Service desk responsiveness to problems.
Perhaps
It's
that
a very
reminds us
big
that
area.
we look at the KPIs of this, make sure that we're seeing the right KPIs when we do have our annual look at the KPIs. And yes, I mean, one thing I would say, having had experience of this, is sometimes no news is good news in IT.
I think
And we have been, I wouldn't say lucky, I hope we've been skilled so far and go.
Thanks, have you finished? President?
I was just going to ask,
Another-
if you have an IT, then please go ahead.
It's on this subject.
No, please, please.
I mean, what's your expectation of budget going forward? Is it going to stabilise at the elevated rate of last year as a new annualised rate, or was that a one-off? And we could go back to the budget you were expecting. What's your expectation?
The aim is to get to the budget that was set and not have it overspent. And Amanda's the business partner. So we're working to do that. I think we need to consider, if we want a higher level of investment in digital solutions, we may need to consider spending more money. So I think there will be options around that. But the aim for the sort of current level of service is to get to the budget, not to get to the budget plus the overspend. That's what we're aiming to do. And I think this year, some of these things were pressures that were one-off and aren't going to come through again. So I think we're going in the right direction already. But there is still quite a lot of work to do on this budget.
So you had a second question.
I'll be very quick. On the facilities, the income generation, I was pleased to hear about the procurement. I was very pleased to hear that. Have we also considered merging offices if we have a lot of empty spaces?
I think that's one of the things that's being looked at.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And we as a leadership team have been challenging you, to be fair, to look at certain sites and say, actually, what's the operational need? So yes.
Right, and sort of cross-service utilization, so that there's not a replication of certain processes within different
Shadow functions.
departments. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. That should definitely be part of the work that we're doing.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's all I have for the time being. Thank you.
I just had a few comments. So just the very silly one is that the numbering of this paper is really off. So
Yeah,
I think page 30 or that appendix 1 has been missed off entirely or not titled, and it actually made navigating the paper really difficult. And I don't normally resort to all these ridiculous TV labels. I did this time because I got completely lost. I think appendix 1 begins on page 55. And it's not entitled that. And then in the list of appendices, appendix 1 is the capital tables. I'm not what we're actually seeing, which is the variances. But anyway, that's beside the point. But just to bear in mind, the next time, a bit of a proofread would be good.
Apologies for that. It was just because there were some issues with the template.
With the IT, God, it was the IT.
We fixed it for the next situation.
Brilliant, thank you. And the only reason it's ever worth being nitpicky about this is just for its understandability and for its transparency for me and the public.
Well, I think primarily for the public,
So yes, so it's very important. We go back to the savings that weren't achieved. I mean, I worked out it was about 16% of our savings we didn't achieve, and I think that's quite high. And I wondered what you thought about that. I mean, I would have imagined I would be shocked if we have underachieved by about 5%, but at 16%, I'm getting a bit worried about it.
I mean, backwards, I don't know.
Maxine was looking alert there.
I'll just come in on that. And I think that there are two main areas where we didn't choose savings. One is where savings were proposed that required a greater contribution from health. And unfortunately, the landscape with the ICB and particularly the continuing healthcare funding changed. And the other is that there were some savings proposed around homelessness and temporary accommodation, which haven't materialised. So those were the two areas. And I think what that means is going forward into, so we haven't got, I think savings that we have in the financial year 24-25 around housing and homelessness are not unrealistic. And for the year ahead, where we have the 90 million gap that we'll shortly be talking about, we need to make sure that that proposals to close that gap around housing are really realistic.
And I think it'll be up to all of us to scrutinise that as well, because it's a very good way of closing budget gaps, is to be optimistic about it.
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, 16%. It's more than we'd like it to be. I think that's true, but it is also the case that in those departments where they haven't made the savings, they've got other underspends that have kind of compensated for that. So, and that has been something that has been considered as we've been going through the year. So I think it's important that it's important that we monitor the savings as we go through the year. We're probably never going to deliver all of them, but you need to see whether you need to take actions to address that. And it isn't. I mean, you could say it's the main. It is a main driver of the overspending one way, but those savings have been compensated for in other ways. So,
and I suppose that brings me on to the longer observation, which is the kind of peaks and troughs, because I think you identified yourself, Mike, that in lots of cases you look at a budget and it's overspent by $1 million, but that might hide an overspend of 4.8 million and an underspend of 3 million. And so then our concern is the 4.8 million baked in forever and the 3 point whatever saving a flash in the pan? And is that being tested fully enough when we're looking at the basis for next year's budget, I suppose? And so when I also was looking at things like the contingency and the centrally held funds to see what they've been spent on, and are they all one-off? And when I looked at the contingency budget, for example, they did all look one-off, but actually they only add up to about 2.9 million, not the full 4.3 million of contingency. We haven't got detail of all of that. The bits that were detailed, pretty well, all of them looked clearly one-off to me and exactly what the contingency is there for. But I couldn't see, unless I can't add up, which is more than likely, I could only see about 2.9 million detailed there. So I think it's really important that we look at things like that and see should they actually be in the budget. And I felt that from this report I couldn't. Imagine you're going to tell me something about them and see.
But no, I think you're right. One or two things may have been excluded, but I'll make sure they make it as a final version.
Right. Good. I think it's but yes, let's hold the thing about the peaks and troughs, because there are big overspends and big underspends, or big. So, for example, in I think housing, there's a big commercial lettings have sort of saved the day because they've come in at 2.3 million above budget, for example, which is great. But is that
FCS has one-off lump things? That wasn't much analysis at the end of the line.
Yeah, how they're going to that, whether that's likely to assist.
Yeah. And I think
that that might finish. So,
well, I think that what I'm trying to reassure is that we do look at that. I mean, that's why I said it. That 1.4 million
absolutely
highlights that. We do look at the overspends, as we've shown with TA in a way, rather than just saying, oh, well, that's all right. We're only 1.4 million overspent, or if that had been normal, we wouldn't say, well, that's fine, we've just hit the budget, because we would look at all those areas of overspend and have done this year. With regards to the underspends that are saving the day, I think we also, certainly look at those and look to bake them in to the budget. So we're not looking at them if they are permanent underspends rather than just one-off ones. So they are seen as opportunities if they're long term and would come forward as savings almost certainly.
That has already been done with some of the commercial income.
Yeah. that's very cheering direction that we're getting in on that.
So that's good, but obviously it means they're not there. You're right, they're not there to save the day again because we've already baked them in. So that's why we have to focus on the overspends.
I suppose we will be interested in seeing how those peaks and troughs are reflected in the budget and if it's realistic. Claire, did you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. Just before we move on, in this current budget that we have, the Wentworth Council undertook to carry out a fundamental review of the HRA. And so in that spirit, I would like to request that the quarterly figures from the HRA come to HCSC.
Yeah.
I don't see why not. One comment from last year's experience in budget working group is that the HRA figures coming at the same time still as the budget process.
I think we're assured. We have been assured that that's going to happen.
That was agreed. That was agreed.
It's agreed last year. And
Joanna, just for
again, first chair and vice chair, the housing community scrutiny group is looking at temporary accommodation, and I think it would be very beneficial if it comes or it works with this committee, or indeed has the agreement of this committee to push forward and do either a deep dive or some form of working group, because actually I think it's so critical to the whole budget process.
we can decide that outside the meeting. Yes, thank you. Okay, so should we move on from there? But I think it's sort of just to draw a small conclusion from this. We're obviously very concerned about TA funding, temporary accommodation funding. We'll want to keep a close eye on what the savings are baked in and overspends are baked in or need to be baked in, and concern about control of IT and IT projects. But I think those are things that we have shown as priorities. Good. Can we then move on to the NTFS? Thank you for coming us with you. Very nice. Would like to introduce this.
Well, I think the first thing is I think it's very good that we have both of these papers coming together. I think they work quite well as companion pieces, and it allows us to kind of see both sides of the ledger. We've covered in some detail the year that's just passed, and this is obviously our look forward. I think what we can see is what Will's alluded to, which is that for at least a couple of years now, we've known that this is going to be a really difficult year. In terms of the assumptions that are baked in, we can cover those in more detail, but in headline terms, we've done what we did last year, which is shown two scenarios. I think there's one that's a kind of, I think of those kind of knowable best and knowable worst cases. There is certainly scope for them to be better or worse than it's reflected here, based on the information we have today. That's what we can forecast, and I think what it shows is going to be really hard. The key for us is going to be the work streams that we've already started to talk about this evening. So things like staffing, kind of commercialization piece, our capital program, and our corporate estate. I think the four key areas of focus for us. We're challenging officers, me as a lead member and the leadership team too, to bring us regular updates. I've asked for updates on all of this to come at a minimum monthly to my briefings. As I say, it's kind of too early for me to give you a sense of where we are with them. But I think we recognise the scale of the challenge. It will force us to work at a pace that hasn't been comfortable for us in the past, and we probably haven't had to achieve in the past. And I will certainly welcome the committee's challenge as we set about that, because we're going to need to utilise all of the breadth of skills and talent within the council together.
Thank you. Sorry, start with it.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the paper. Very interesting, and I agree, Johnny, it works very well having them both together. I said quite a lot about, I mean, the focus on the appendix 6, addressing the budget gap, I think was the area that I've already said quite a bit about the non-customer facing staff and facilities. And I don't think I need to repeat that. I would think there's a third area I think you need to look at, and that's discretionary functions. The council, of course, the statutory functions. There's also other things that we do, and I think we need to have a long hard look at those and really understand where we're going to make choices. So are there things that we're doing that we actually don't need to be doing, local government doesn't need to absolutely need to do. And I think on page 112, you almost get the impression that the second homes premium is a done deal, and I would tell you that I don't think you can rely on getting it through, and I don't think you can rely on, secondly, on it does get through raising the amount of money that's attributed to it. So I think you need to be done your planning not to have that baby out of the rather large collection in the God. And I think that really emphasises the need of real transformation in the way that Will was describing earlier. And it's something perhaps we can contribute to the budget working group this year, but that's something for us as a committee to think about. But those are observations for an Egypt. Perhaps the new one I mentioned was the discretionary activities, so perhaps might have to reflect that on that.
Yes. I mean, my sense of that would be that we could separate out the role of discretionary services and the breadth of discretionary services and have kind of a closer look at which we want to potentially rationalise. I'm not averse to doing that. I think my expectation of how things would be working at the moment would be that is effectively a process that folds into the work streams that I've described. So if we are looking at things like staffing and we're looking at non-customer facing primarily roles, then within that you would think we would be hitting discretionary services in some way. When I say consider, we can taking them out. So I mean, we would be, expending energy looking at whether we're running them as effectively as possible, first of all, whether we need them. And did so with things like, I suppose, with the corporate estate. I mean, there would be parts of the estate where services are being run, and parts of that work would be looking at whether we require that part of the estate to be run in that way. So I think it's a valid observation. I'm happy to take it away and discuss it with colleagues. It may be that we do want to look at it in that way, but I would certainly be very disappointed if to officers that was taken as a kind of, well, okay, now you ask us to look at discretionary services. I think we should be, and I'm confident that we would be looking at them as parts of the work streams that form parts of the transformation and savings programme already.
Thank you. Well,
thank you. I agree with you that it's useful to have the upturn 23-4 and the MGFS 25-6-7-9 together. But in effect, that leaves a year out in the middle, and I think it would be useful to have some assurance that the three reports, the outturn, the budget from the current year and the MTFS, were, once we've now got this outturn, that still remain aligned in terms of the assumptions that are in there, because those pieces of work were done separately at different times, and there's new information. So it'd be useful to get some assurance that they are still aligned.
Well, I would have thought they should be aligned, but I suppose that might be different from being the same, because it might be that pressures or opportunities emerge in year that mean what we've written in the MTFS in June differs from what we're seeing in terms of the outturn at the end of Q1. But I take the point that they should talk to each other and that they should broadly share the same assumption.
That's the real point. I mean, they're also not going to do it month by month.
Yeah.
They do broadly. You mentioned also the staff, commerce, capital, and corporate estate.
Yeah.
I wonder how much attention is being paid to the partnership working with sometimes with outside agencies like the NHS. I mean, I refer back to what Maxine was saying just now. There's some of the anticipated help from the NHS was not forthcoming. having been through, I suppose, a declared interest because I'm a board member of the governor of the Charles Westminster Hospital. But having been through a briefing on what the ICB is up to at the moment, they're doing another strategic review, and it doesn't look as though they're going to be at all looking at how they can help fund things outside. They're really focusing on their responsibilities internally. So maybe that's just a little helpful advice. And I think that the MTFS, I think it needs to start checking more as to whether the transformations really are going to work, as we've been talking about, and looking at. There is some reference to here to, the good, best news and worst news, and I just think we need more granularity on that, because there really is a question as to whether the transformations in the IT, dev staff training, the new ways of working, and all those things can bring efficiency to process long term, and new ways of such things, the youth review and so on, which are radically different ways of financing.
Yeah, they are. Yes, yeah.
There's a lot of potential in some of it, and it's early diagnosis in schools and if these things are going to happen, are they real? The question needs to be asked.
Okay. Well, in terms of, and you might want to come on these, in terms of partnership working, I would have thought, well, I expect we are considering partnership working in some areas, but in others, some funding is quite uncertain, so it's quite difficult to base an MTFS on what are often one-off or kind of needs to be uncertain sources of funding. But where we can better consider how we use our resources, especially is probably in the capital programme, because probably in the past we've accounted for a larger amounts of borrowing than we end up possibly needing to borrow, and if we can use either our balances or we can think more carefully about where there might be opportunities for grant or match funding, that potentially there is.
I suppose a classic example is when the Environment Select Committee proposed measures in the carbon zero, and the answer was it's going to cost 150 million quid. We ain't got the money, but actually the spend, if you look at it, is pretty near that. In terms of a profile, because of the match funding that's coming from outside.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, the retrofit accelerator work is a good example of that, of a program in which we are basing kind of the pace of delivery and the budget profile on both what we've missed and what has been missed externally. So I think it does happen in places, and in other places it's harder. That's probably not very granular, but that's kind of a general impression on it. And then in terms of whether transformations are real, I think I share your desire to see more detail. It's still quite early in the financial year, so I suppose it may be that some of that work isn't complete yet, or isn't at a stage where it's ready to be shared, but maybe, I would like to see it too.
Maybe an individual scrutiny committee, so perhaps yes, we'll want to help if we can, using what you've already promised under the previous item.
Yeah. Thank you. Right. Joanne, did you have a question?
I do. Page 189, paragraph 12. Mike, I think we spoke briefly about this at English last night, but I would actually like to understand the financial impact of this. So both the cost of doing this whole assessment on the leases, and also then the impact that will then have on the balance sheet. And so what is the budgeting effect longer term? So there's an initial cost of doing the work and getting these valued and appreciation. So then what does that then mean for budgeting?
I don't think they'll have maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they'll have a substantial effect on what this report is trying to do in terms of the gap, really. This report is really about the gaps that we've got to find and the processes we've got in place to find those gaps. Whereas I think this is a more technical
This is going to have depreciation actually each time, and it's going to go on the balance sheet. I said last night. So
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand, are we talking millions? Is this suddenly going to come appear on our budget? And is it going to be significant?
The impact over a lease's life will be basically equal. There might be a slight difference in year. Just where the accounting works, they won't have a major impact on the budget in the year.
So when they first go on the budget, it will have an impact.
No, it will change the balance sheet, but there'll be an asset and a liability created, so it'll be even. And we can share some how it works, but yeah, the revenue budget is effectively net nil over the lifetime.
And the costing of the exercise doing it, how much is that anticipated to be? That's a new spend, actually.
I don't think it'll be a significant amount, one that kind of changes the gap. I mean, I suppose the thing is that there is so much uncertainty in terms of the gaps that we face. I mean, highlighted by the fact that we have a best case and a worst case, but I think what Johnny said, a knowable best case and a knowable worst case is a quite good word for it, because there are circumstances, very foreseeable circumstances in which it could be different, probably, or could be worse than the worst case. I can't see many in which it's going to be better than the best case, but so
Natural optimism.
so there is an enormous amount of uncertainty. So I don't think in those terms that what this exercise costs or the implications of it will have any material effect, really, is what I'm saying. So it will have an accounting effect, but it won't materially affect. It won't suddenly create a big change to this. But I think there is a lot of uncertainty, and that's really what I wanted to highlight about the whole process. There is a lot of uncertainty in this MTFS anyway, because we are probably in the most uncertain time. I mean, I feel like I'm saying ever since I've been at this council, but we haven't. The uncertainty does just seem to keep getting more. And one of the things we've highlighted is fair funding. If I could just come back to Councillor Hammond's point about the second homes program and so forth. So we're not saying we're assuming that's going to happen at all. That's certainly not what that paragraph is meant to say. I think what we're saying is that the modelling that's been done about the potential impact of fair funding, the people who did the modelling for us took account of that. The reason they did that is because it may be taken account of in terms of the allocations that the council receives going forward. So the next government may assume that we do at second homes and with the full premium, in which case it would affect our funding, and obviously that probably will put more pressure on to do it. But it's not our assumption we're going to close the gap as we're currently seeing it by that second homes premium.
Thank you. Toby.
I just wanted to pick up again on the staffing aspect on page 155. That the 2% staff reductions that we had in this current budget was quite a blunt instrument, and I just wonder whether you have plans for it to be a bit more data driven going forwards.
It's not a 2% staff reduction. It's a saving of 2%, mostly by vacancies. So it's not. I mean, it has would be arbitrary to say in effect that we're not going out and reducing the number of staff by 2%. We're just holding vacancies for longer, or reducing the number of agency cover or whatever, so that we're saving on the
2% savings.
So the budget saving, and it is probably fair to say it's fairly blunt, a fairly sort of blunt saving, because it's just an estimate based on experience of what can be achieved on that. So I think going forward, the transformation programme does have more evidence-based ways of looking at the staffing that we have, and that includes having a look at process reviews, what the processes of the council are, and how they're staffed. That's part of the transformation programme. having a look at specific posts and whether there's the opportunity to, or the possibility of not filling vacancies. That's what the recruitment panels are about. And we also want to look at productivity and performance as well. So
Because I think the distinction that Councillor Howard made about discretionary and statutory services, we need to make very sure and be careful that any reductions are not impacting on service delivery. And I think there have been reductions in housing needs previous year, and then that's where we see the KPIs go. We notice the impact there, and that seems to be potentially vulnerable. And I think in licensing as well. Once you reduce to a certain point, then you do start to have an impact. And where it is a statutory service in particular, I think you need to be very, very careful.
It reinforces our need to look at those KPIs within our committees as well.
I would just say that the, idea, really, every reduction should, every member of staff should be contributing to service delivery, whether they're support services or customer facing, and therefore if you reduce them, there must be an impact. There should be an impact on service delivery, but not necessarily any. What we've got to look for is how we reduce the impact on outcomes, service outcomes,
Yes.
really. But
Yes,
but-
obviously.
but I don't think you can just say that. I don't think we employ staff that to have a positive impact on service delivery. Therefore, the converse should also be true.
I think there's probably a threshold. I think there's probably a threshold below which you start to see risk of failure.
Yeah,
And I think
absolutely. Yeah,
as a council with the history, we need to be looking at not going beyond that threshold because of the outcomes for the residents who we are hoping to be a fairer council for.
Thank you.
so that is the intention.
Do we have the data right now of the staffing, the service we provide, and of how effective we are? I know as a councillor we are very effective. I think we're one of the best, but just it would be nice to have some data on that.
Well, we've got more data on staffing than we've had previously, and we're trying to develop that data. I mean, it is true that the data we get from the IBC system that we joined, the Hampshire IBC system, it doesn't give us all the data we need, which is why we've got a new system being implemented. So our data is far from perfect, but we have got more data than we need to have. Sorry.
Benchmarking against similar local authorities, and we are quite flush on staff when we do that benchmarking. So that's another thing to bear in mind, isn't it?
You're saying that by being flush that we're inefficient.
I think
Well, we are well provided with staff, and some of that may be reflected in our outcomes. With social workers particularly, but
I think that reflects the data I've seen as well.
Is that benchmarking reflected in this work?
yes.
sure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons there's two drivers for that. And one is that certainly in areas like children's services, we've historically made choices to be well staffed, and that is reflected, I think, in the outcomes in terms of being outstanding and so forth. So we've made those choices, and we've got the benefits of it. We also, if you do it on a per capita basis, because we always borough by population, and indeed that population is now fallen further collectively, but the census anyway. On a per capita basis, we will come up as being more flush with staff than say Bromley or
the question is, if you join up all the dots on this, is if we did actually cut back on children's services and become less flush with services, would put less in, would we actually have bigger problems as a result, which cost us even more money?
I think that's why we've made a strategic choice in the past too. But it's not just there. I think there is a very good argument for us saying that we've made that strategic choice in the past, for particularly for vulnerable services, safeguarding services.
Yeah.
But there are that doesn't stop us looking at the rest of our services and our support services and saying, are we over provided there compared to other boroughs as well?
Yeah, I mean,
And also the whole viewing of processes and all the other things that go with staffing. So
yeah,
I
the
just-
per capita figures are basically pretty stark. I think in terms of staff to resident, we have our ratio is an outlier. And our staffing budget has grown over the past 5 years pretty considerably. So any reasonable attempt to close a gap of this nature is going to have to involve staffing to a pretty reasonable degree. You're right, there are safeguarding tests a little bit more careful, but it's not unique to that area. And it's one of the reasons why, although in some ways it can be a blunt instrument, it's essential that it's quite a big part of it because it's such a big part of our overall spend.
Is it just throwing it out there, would we ever consider AI?
We do.
Yes.
We already use AI for many things. Yeah. And would we consider using it in other ways? Yes, of course. I guess every use case would have to be, properly thought through in terms of, how are we doing that function at the moment? Will we be more efficient? Are there risks in terms of residents interacting with it and potentially getting inaccurate or whatever in terms of the sensitivity of the service? But no, AI is part of what we do. I mean, I can think of lots of ways in which we're thinking about using it. If you think about a lot of offices now use Copilot. So they're able to draft emails, put together slide decks, take minutes of meetings using AI, which is certainly an efficiency if you think about it relative to having support staff in the room. In terms of service delivery, there are lots of ways that you could think about using it. So, for example, you could use AI to trigger enforcement action. If you send a photograph to street line, or your equivalent of street line, you could have an AI system that basically looks at it. So you don't need somebody at a laptop, and every staff member therefore is out on the street going and actioning the enforcement. Because they just get a ping on their phone, and the AI has told them, this is a high priority area. I mean, I could pretty much go through every service, but
so
AI is
that would be,
the plus answer is yes.
I've got one quick question. On 812, there is reference to a new sort of philosophy relating to reserves or a new policy. Terms of reference, new terms of reference relating to reserves.
Yes.
163.
163. Yeah, this would have been maybe a year ago now. So when we spoke about it being recent, it's all relative.
New.
Yeah. So yes, it's new in the lifetime of the council. And I wouldn't want to overstate it. I think what I sought to do, or rather what I observed first of all, was that the rate of depletion of our reserves was a concern to me and probably to colleagues. It's not something we've fully solved. We're still spending more than we bring in terms of reserves, and obviously if you keep going that it only goes one way. But one of the controls that I sought to introduce when I came into the portfolio was a set of kind of terms of reference in terms of the special projects, the council plan implementation reserve, and a couple of others. Some of those key reserves, whereby effectively, if you don't use the money within a certain time frame, then it reverts, so that you have slippage. Also trying to kind of make it harder for effectively ongoing revenue to be capitalized in terms of things like staff costs. I think we've been too lax on that. And it's those sorts of things. I mean, what we could do is just circulate them after.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
But the thrust of them is kind of that. It's to stall the depletion of our reserves and to ensure that we're spending reserves where appropriate, rather than kind of using it as a way of backsliding in terms of.
I think given the current financial climate, it would be very, but it becomes even more interesting and useful for us to know that. So So yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that over the past year has probably saved us anywhere from must be approaching £5 million in terms of spend that we've just been able to say. And I think as a council over the years, we've probably been a bit too lax on our officers or on our colleagues about use of reserves. So I think quite often, because our financial outlook has been stronger than a lot of other boroughs, we said, okay, well, that's all right, we'd like to do it. And because the context is changing, we have to look at it a lot harder. And the terms of reference are quite a good way to do that, because it takes the kind of political emotion out of the decision.
Gives you a shield to hide behind.
Yes, and I guess what I'm saying is it's already worked to some extent, although not to the extent that would reassure me fully.
Well, that's encouraging. Thank you. So I think just to sort of sum up, we've got.
Can I ask one other question?
Quickly, well,
Just a short one. Do you have a short explanation about how overheads are calculated and allocated to different offices and departments? So is there a standard way of this being across the country?
Well, we have a recharge process for producing the accounts. I mean, not.
No, what I'm talking about is that officers use space. The directorates are charged overheads to spread the cost of, so the more that officers use space here, the more overhead they attract.
That's all done below the line, isn't it? So it's all done based on the space they have. So if you're asking, is it real money? I mean, in terms of them receiving it, it probably is.
So in terms of home working, efficient use of space here, and so on, it is a major factor.
Yeah, they get charged a recharge based on the amount of space they occupy, but that recharge will be the same as their budget. So there isn't an incentive for the individual officers or the individual departments or sections to say, oh, we'll use less space. So we're looking at that strategically instead, as we said earlier, looking at how much space we occupy as a council and what buildings we have and whether we can make that more efficient. And for instance, we've moved the legal team and moved within this building to free up space that we hope to then be able to let. So we do look at opportunities, but it's not driven by a charging method.
Thank you. Okay. Well, if I could just sum up, we were asked to consider whether financials assumptions are robust and reasonable. We're assured that they are, but we just have noted the big the savings and there are quite a lot of savings, masking some of the overspends, and we're assured that those have been taken into account, but we will want to have a look at that over the next year. And we've talked about in the second bullet point, progress was closing the reported budget gap. We talked about transformation. We're going to see that again at our next meeting. So there's a degree of anxiety about what can be achieved in what time, and I think would reflect the mood of the committee. But obviously we'll be taking a big interest on it, and I think that's probably most of our will be the subject, most of our feedback to the week. But thank you very much for being here. We're standing an hour and a half of us asking lots of questions, but I think it's been really helpful in setting us up to thinking about the budget for the next year. It's been a very good use for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're looking at the field plan of key decisions, which is agenda item 6 on page 93. And we're going to page through them. And if anybody thinks that they or that their committee or anybody else is going to put something on Facebook, please shout out. So just look at page 1. It's actually page 199. Be able to think. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes. Well, I'll go to Joanna and then Claire.
Suspected on the same one.
Oh, okay.
I'll find it out. I'll test my care.
Okay.
Well, I have marked this first one at the bottom of page 9. And in fact, quite a few others. There's quite a few procurement pieces coming up. And I wondered whether these might fit into single piece perhaps for our committee. What were you going to say, Joanna?
I had executive a question of next order.
Yeah.
I didn't know, for example, on page 9 was now that critical repairs contract as opposed to that's day-to-day repairs as opposed to external repairs. But there have been big issues about repairs contract and delivery of it. So I think I'm not so sure that this committee.
So not necessarily falling in these key decisions, but requesting a report at your own committee around procurement.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. But then let's move on to page 10. 11. 12. 13.
13 has got the procurement strategy in there again. For more measure function, so that would maybe be
Stick your report. Fine, good. 14. 15. 15, you're probably in this. 17. Having public last. 18. 19. 20. 21. 22. And this,
Right. On a general question, I always find key decisions, lots of them aren't coming to the inboxes, I don't know, to what extent the newer councillors are particularly familiar with key decisions or how they sign up to it. And I wonder whether actually we ever, as this committee, there is ever any KPIs on engagement on key decisions or reviews of decisions, and whether backbenchers or indeed councillors, public actually engage in engagement. So I wondered whether there were any things or facts or things or data on effectiveness of key decisions. Because this plan, Claire and I were talking about it before, the not befores are never very helpful, and some of them are terribly out of date. And you just live in.
Jack, do you want to comment on this? Because it's something we've discussed.
Yeah, so some of if you're talking about engagement on the KD, some of it will be within the KD reports. So they will say in the report, it's developing policy and strategy. We've consulted with residents. So, for example, Callum came to the last meeting and talked about the engagement that he'd done around those KDs. So the information will be within those individual KDs about how many people have been consulted and how they've been consulted. Some, I think, will be less engagement. So if it's awarded contract, that would be more, as you know, according to the procurement rules rather than engagement. But there might be some questions to ask about design and specification to get that contract. What was engagement around that?
If I could fill in behind something that Jack has just said, it varies according to KD, but recently the FCS Select Committee has done a reference report to KD, to the leadership team on a KD on the youth review. And some of the questions we raised are going to prompt a considerable response from the leadership team. And also, in fact, one of the issues we raised as a doubt came true, unfortunately, about half an hour before the leadership team, the KD was actually pulled. So these things can be real, and sometimes the KDs can be very obscure and clearly procurement process driven.
I think to some extent the answer to your question is that a lot of the engagement has already occurred before the KD gets put on the thing, and so probably we don't get a lot of, and maybe we ought to find out how much public interest ever in the KDs, because they've already been past the kind of discussion phase. But it is very important that they're published, particularly stuff like procurement, but transparency and openness. But sorry, Claire, you wanted to add?
Yes, I was just going to add, in the interest of maximising our chances and possibility for pre-decision scrutiny, these actually become pretty important.
Yes, so
Now,
now
they,
process we've just been through now
yeah,
is to allow.
exactly. So they're used, I mean, some of these are sort of fairly out of date and some things may not be on there yet. For example, a consultation, what have you. We used to get a really regular email with all the key decisions, which I think went to all councillors. Then there seemed to be some change in the email system, and now doesn't appear to be happening. And I wanted to
investigate.
I'm making a note that I will investigate.
We used to be able to opt in or opt out, and not everybody.
Yeah, so there's.
So it may be that when there was change, people didn't.
There's daily emails and then there's a weekly email
Yeah,
at the end of the week that summarises everything.
Yeah.
I don't seem to be getting those.
So I think you might sign up to them through the my RBKC. So I think you have to go in and sign
Yeah,
up.
Would
so
you
when
check
that change
that,
happens,
Yeah, I'll check.
Because
It's
one
not
thing,
for me.
one thing to do would be to opt
I am
everybody in globally
Yes,
and then
they
let
go
them
on
talk.
I don't know if I can do that.
No, not you, but IT, but somebody might be able to.
Yeah.
The weekly one comes in the councillor account, so it's
Yeah.
not a subscribe to my RBKC because that.
Yeah.
No, but as a councillor, you can unsubscribe to that.
Oh, can you?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, definitely. You, at some point, you said, I want to be, probably when you first joined the council, you wanted to get the weekly report. You're just super keen, but you can
So
unsubscribe.
the weekly one came automatically. It used to come automatically for me,
No,
and
no.
now I don't seem to be having it. The only ones I have.
Either way, we'll check it out. It's an important point. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it's more up to date than this.
Yes, exactly.
This has been published 7 days ago.
Yes.
So the one you get on Friday, if you signed up, will be much more up to date.
Jackie will occasionally know that she gets an email written by me over breakfast on Saturday morning when I'm looking at this thing, which doesn't come until about 6 o'clock on Saturday morning.
But I'm not there until.
No, I know. I don't expect an answer from you till Monday.
And then agenda item 7, sorry, Chair, for you, under scrutiny work programme. Every other committee has nobly been through this process, except this committee. We're trying to find a date.
Email 2 days today. I was asked to do it after the election. I appreciate everybody's busy and they've got commitments. I'm doing my best to find a date.
And well done, everybody, for your individual work programme meetings, which I think were very well and for well attended. So I'm very pleased with that. Thank you. So unless there's any other business, meeting is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Everybody's new.
Can I